there's a bit of a sweet spot in the middle where, you're getting the right amount of connection and focus on the relationship with your partner, but then at the same time, you're getting supports elsewhere and you're not relying on your partner for everything.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're going to talk about men's relationships, but not relationships with their peers. We're going to talk about their romantic relationships with a partner. Joining me is Michael Wilson. Michael is a researcher at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and his research explores the role of men's romantic relationships and relationship breakdowns on their mental health and well-being. I want to talk to Michael about what a healthy relationship looks like, what happens when a relationship breaks down, and what can guys do to navigate a breakup. It's a lot to unpack here, so let's jump right into it. Welcome to the podcast, Michael. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, so on the podcast in previous episodes, we've talked a lot about men's peer relationships and how guys can interact and connect and support each other. But today I want to focus specifically on men's romantic relationships and how maybe our buddies can support us through challenging times or a breakup that we have. This is a topic that I know is very interesting to you, and you've done quite a bit of work in this area. As I understand, it's making up a good portion of your PhD. So what really got you interested in this topic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a few different reasons. Primarily, I suppose, feeling the discomfort of trying to support friends of mine going through really intense breakups and not knowing what to say or what is going to be most helpful to support them through it, but sort of, witnessing some really intense distress, but not knowing, yeah, what's going to be most useful for them. So there's that, but also, my own experiences of, some pretty difficult breakups and not necessarily feeling like I had the best supports around me. So I think it's kind of both for me in terms of, the personal experience of it, but then also the experience supporting others. So that's kind of the personal reason. And then I think in terms of the wider research I'd done around men's mental health and suicide prevention, I was just really noticing that again and again in any study we did looking at any indicator of suicide risk, relationship issues and or breakdown just came up so often as a factor. But to my knowledge, at the time, and that's sort of still the case now, the bulk of the research in that area really just fails to kind of dig into what's going on for men here. It's all just men versus women, who's more at risk. So there's really not been all that much to try and really unpack what it is about relationships and relationship breakdown that kind of is such an impact on men's mental health and what can we do about it. And that was just, something that really frustrated me because I just, saw a huge gap and not enough being done. So yeah, both are kind of personal and sort of professional, I guess, drive to delve into this area. So
Yeah. And as you say, it's a very complex issue. It's also a very common issue. Everybody has experience with relationships. I would say the majority of people would have experience with a breakup at least at some point in their lifetime, whether it be in the schoolyard or as an adult, when there's kids involved and finances and all those things that go in hand with it. It's also a very hot topic right now. Relationships and especially straight relationships between men and women. You see a lot of this on social media, and there's a lot of anger that can come between those relationships as well, I think.
Totally. I think, we're in a strange time now where we're asking more of men than ever before in terms of their emotions, their disclosure, their vulnerability, their openness, what's really going on for them. And I think that comes with some sort of teething problems at times in terms of like, are we ready to hear what is really going on for men? And do we know what to do with that at times? So I think in a way, all the kind of commentary and everything around it is useful because it helps us kind of understand the issues more, particularly when it comes to, things like violence in relationships and things like that. But equally, we need to know how to respond to these issues in an adaptive and healthy way, because otherwise, we're just sort of stoking the problem. We're not actually moving forward and doing anything about it. So yeah, it's an interesting idea, like all of this kind of pop psych relationshipy sort of advice that's going around online. There's so much of it. And I think it's great to an extent because it helps people think about their relationships and reflect on, what's going on for them. But I think a bit of a gap is where actual research and evidence comes in to really back up the advice that just circulates online, particularly, on things like TikTok and stuff where it's such a quick fire. No one's getting really rigorous relationship advice in a 30-second TikTok. So I think that's an interesting area to try and bridge these accessible self-help tips that are out there with like actual evidence-based solutions. And that's where, hopefully we can come in and help out there.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, is that source even a positive impact on your relationship? Some of the advice that's
Mm,
circulating out there right now can be, not overly positive to begin with. But before we
definitely.
jump into that, and I'm keen to dive into some of these topics more specifically, but starting at kind of the top level here, I want to talk about a healthy relationship first. So, what are some of the broader health benefits and social benefits of being in a healthy romantic relationship?
Sure. I think, to my knowledge anyway, in terms of any health or kind of psychosocial emotional outcome you look at, across the board, men and people in general who are in healthy, long-lasting relationships fare better than those who are single or separated or divorced on essentially any outcome you look at. So the long and the short of it is essentially relationships are good. They're good for us. They're good for our social network. They're good for everybody. We're wired to connect as humans, and a relationship is just a sort of foundational aspect of our identity at times. So it can really kind of help us know who we are and know what we value and how we want to move through the world, essentially. But in terms of the health benefits and the benefits to our kind of well-being and things like that, some people link this to the idea of what's called the kind of social control of health in a relationship, where because a romantic partner, is invested in you and you staying well and you doing well, they will kind of, monitor what's going on for you, what your health is kind of looking like, and to an extent kind of control and make sure that you're doing everything you can to keep yourself well. So whether that looks like, making sure you're going to the GP regularly, or you're, seeking help if you need it, if you're struggling with your mental health, eating healthily, exercising, all of these kind of different things that we know are beneficial to our health, a partner can really play a role in kind of making sure that we're doing the things that are most beneficial for us at the time.
And especially, in the broader context of our social relationships, we've talked in the past about how kind of social circles can dissipate and get smaller
Mhm.
as guys get older. I suppose it can be kind of a positive and a negative here, that one of the reasons for that is guys spend more time focused on their
Mm,
family and their work and things like that. But the benefit is that it becomes kind of your social identity, and that's, a primary point of your social connection. Someone, as
mm,
you say, that you can lean on for support, that you can share deeper ideas and emotions than probably anyone else.
totally. Yeah. And I think that's a big positive, particularly once we, get into relationships in kind of emerging and what we call sort of established adulthood, when people might start to really commit to the length of their relationship through marriage or something like that, or when people start to have kids, it's, it obviously has to happen that someone will spend most of their time doing something that is in some way invested in their romantic relationship. There's just not enough hours in the week to spend as much time with your friends as you are, with your partner or looking after your kids or at work so you can provide for your family. That's what I guess contributes to the health of a relationship, is kind of balancing all of that. But at the same time, what we know from some research is that too little investment in a social network and a peer group and sort of connection outside of the relationship is actually linked to lower relationship quality. But equally, too much investment in a social network, not enough investment in the relationship and your partner, is also linked to lower relationship quality. So there's a bit of a sweet spot in the middle where, you're getting the right amount of connection and focus on the relationship with your partner to really foster that. But then at the same time, you're getting supports elsewhere and you're not relying on your partner for everything. And it's hard to say what that looks like because it's different for everyone. Relationships are a really hard thing to research because there just so many things play into it, so many factors kind of influence what that looks like for each person. But I think it's more of a feeling that each person might individually have. Like, do you feel like you're getting enough or you're spending enough time prioritizing your relationship, or is it too much time with your friends, or what's the balance looking like? So even just being aware of that and kind of checking in with yourself, I think is a really healthy thing to do.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
probably checking in with your partner as well. There's the reflective aspect of thinking to yourself about how that relationship is going and, from your perspective. But, actually verbalizing that to your partner and asking them where they're at, are things working for them? Because you may not see the bigger picture of relying on your partner too heavily, and they're feeling the weight of not only their own struggles and stresses in life, but if you're
Mm.
putting all that on your partner,
Hmm.
that I think, especially for guys, can be a pretty big cause of tension in relationships.
Hmm. Hmm. Totally. Yeah. I think it's a really important thing to talk about. And I'm not suggesting, people should sit down every week and have a conversation like this. If you want to, great. But position it as you, your partner, and the relationship as this third factor that you're both invested in the health of, and you both want to succeed. It's about how can we work together to make sure that we're both contributing equally to this relationship to make sure that it's benefiting us both equally. I think when people come into these conversations and it's a you and a me kind of, against each other to an extent and being like, what am I doing? What are you doing? And you sort of forget that there's this third factor here, which is the relationship, that is what you're both really, focused on investing in. So I think that's, a good tactic that I've heard some people have found beneficial is coming into conversations with that sort of approach. Yeah.
Mhm. And I
Yeah.
guess it's the assumption is not always that it's going to be perfect blue skies, that
Mhm.
there won't be
Totally.
any conflict in a relationship. So, what are some of these ways that guys can approach tension in a relationship? And maybe
Mhm.
even starting with what are some of the causes of common relationship tensions?
Well, firstly, one of the causes is I think people not necessarily, or people going into relationships assuming that it's always going to be blue skies and, perfect romance and everything. I think we've been sold as a society a very romanticized idea that when you find the one, it's going to be perfect all the time and there's never going to be any conflict and whatever. But I don't think that is just true at all. I don't think it's realistic because, we're all human, we're all flawed, we all make mistakes. And I think we can't expect a person to fulfill kind of every role for us. And I think, the idea we've been sold is that, as I said, when we find the one, it's the person that's going to meet every need all of the time for us. So I think, coming into a relationship knowing or expecting things to not work out all the time, or expecting conflict at some stage, or sort of not being overly surprised by that, I think can be a healthy way to come into it. Because it just means that if conflict does come up, you're not totally blindsided and you're not just like, oh, it's all falling apart because we're having conflict at this time. Ongoing conflict can, be a sign that maybe a relationship isn't working out. But I think it's just an inevitable reality of relationships that it's important to just accept that is going to happen. And it's more about equipping yourself to navigate that when it comes up. And
Hmm.
in terms of what can be helpful in navigating that, open, honest communication that positions how can we solve this problem together, as opposed to you are the problem, I'm the solution sort of thing, or like a kind of adversarial approach, I don't think is very helpful. If there's conflict, that can be quite difficult to maintain, particularly, if you're pissed off that your partner's done something, you don't think you've done anything wrong, that can be really difficult. But I think phrasing it in a way of like, this has happened, this is how it made me feel. How can we work together to solve this problem? Yeah.
Hmm. And, it's interesting because, as you said before, guys have been told as of recent that they need to show more of themselves. They need to
Mm.
express their emotions more. And for a lot of guys, their romantic relationship can be a safe space to do that. But there are still kind of those gender roles and norms that can come up in a relationship.
Mm.
And, you see stories on social media from men and women that say, oh, I opened up to my partner and, it was a complete turnoff to them, that they
Mm.
looked at me differently, that it wasn't necessarily a safe space. So, how do we balance this call to show more of ourselves and,
Mm.
potentially as a strategy to get through some of those tensions with those norms of the roles that men take in a straight relationship, and you know what I mean?
That's a huge, huge question, isn't
It
it?
really is.
I think, and as I said before, I think we're in just such an interesting time where, we're wanting men to open up and emote more because, to an extent, we feel that that is what is broadly beneficial in terms of men's mental health. And I think it is. It's, if we're encouraging men to engage more with their emotions, then they might be more likely to seek help if things are not going so well. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of people out there, regardless of gender, who are attracted to the idea of someone who's not too sensitive, who does have a degree of emotional stoicism and is able to kind of get through life's up and downs without kind of letting things affect them too much. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being attracted to that in a partner. I think what's important is flexibility, both for men and their partners, in terms of what you're expecting from your partner and what you're kind of providing in a relationship. So I suppose what that can look like for men is if you're not necessarily comfortable, being emotionally open and vulnerable, it's about sort of acknowledging that and doing the best you can if that's something your partner is looking for, to work on that and to work together to kind of cultivate that in a relationship. And then equally, if you are quite emotional and your partner's not into that and it's, not sort of feeling right for them, if you're the partner in that situation, I think it's also important to acknowledge, that people can come into relationships at kind of different levels of comfort with vulnerability and all that sort of stuff, and that can happen regardless of gender. So I think just flexibility and adaptability, and if you're invested in the relationship, being willing to work on things together as opposed to kind of working against one another, I think is kind of the most important approach. I feel like there's a very vague answer, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think, part of it is kind of just flagging that is that it's not a
Mm.
perfect solution, that you have to do it in a way that works for you. And I mean, for me, if you have a partner that's telling you that you need to be emotionally restrictive all the time,
Mm.
depending on where in the relationship you are, if we're kind of early on getting to know each other, that's probably a red flag for me. Just
Mm. Mm.
understanding the inevitability of my future life, that it's not going to be perfect all the time. So, one kind of raising that as like, well, hey, that doesn't really work for me because things will happen, you know, whether it's work related, whether it's with your friends, or whether it's between the two individuals. You need to be able to express yourself and
Mm.
talk through those things for sure.
Yeah. And I think that's where flexibility is just the most important thing. Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with valuing or being attracted to someone who is emotionally kind of, a bit more restrictive, not as kind of open or sensitive or whatever. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's about acknowledging that life's up and downs are inevitably going to affect people, and there's going to be times where it's not all rosy, and people might need to express themselves a bit more. And I think just being open to that and being open to kind of learning how to navigate that and incorporate that into the relationship is what's most important.
Mhm. So let's move on to this idea of what happens after the breakup. For
Mhm.
whatever reason, they weren't able to resolve the problems, or it wasn't a good fit to begin with. They've now separated. Are guys impacted differently at this stage? Are there some key factors that we see continuing to come up for men in particular that are going through a breakup?
It's a really interesting question. I think, to my knowledge anyway, in terms of the actual emotional impact of a relationship breakdown, so this idea of post-relationship grief that people experience, which is, a really normal reaction, there doesn't seem to be too much difference in terms of the actual raw emotional reactions to a breakup between men and women.
Mm.
But I think where differences do come up is how that distress is responded to and how that distress manifests, I suppose. So it can be quite common for men to maybe withdraw completely, have some time of quiet solitude, I think, and needing to kind of go inwards and process and really understand what's going on. Whereas women might be more inclined to kind of reach out, or to have people reach out to them, I suppose, to collectively process that. On the other hand, I think it can be quite common for men to, if they're not as inclined to internalize and withdraw, they could be inclined to, I guess, what we call externalize their distress. So that might look like, going out more than usual, drinking more than usual, using substances more than usual to kind of externalize the pain that you're experiencing and hopefully, I guess, numb that distress. So it's interesting, like, the question often comes up, who's more impacted by breakups? Is it men or is it women? I think that's an oversimplification to an extent, and I think it's more important to kind of focus on how people are responding to that distress more so than the level of distress itself. Because I think the level of kind of what we call breakup distress or post-relationship grief is more often tied to things like, how attached you were to your ex-partner, how much kind of processing of the breakup you've done in advance prior to it actually ending, the longevity of the relationship, how integrated your partner is in your social life. All of those sort of factors are kind of related to gender, but I don't think they are inherently different between men and women in most cases. So that's kind of the initial sort of relationship breakdown, I suppose. But I think beyond the sort of raw emotional impact, I think that's where we start to see some differences come up, more often between men and women. And here I'm talking about these ideas of sort of loss of connection, loss of social support, and not having as many avenues to address those losses, I think is kind of more common for men than women on average. Again, we're talking in kind of very general terms and stereotypes here, but I think it definitely rings true to an extent that particularly if men aren't the ones initiating a breakup, they could potentially feel blindsided when their relationship ends and sort of be left, with potentially no one to turn to. And it's definitely come up in some interviews I've done where if a relationship ends, because of, some potentially poor behavior from men in a relationship, it can be quite common for the sort of social circle to, I guess, take sides to an extent, which, it happens. It's not good for anyone, but I think, it's important for men to sort of think about if that does happen. Yes, it's okay to be really hurt by that, but I think it's important to think about what your role might have been in the end of the relationship, because it's only through acknowledging that will you be able to move forward. So, yeah.
For me, if we zoom way out and look at kind of the big picture around suicide risk and stuff, that was one of the things that got me really interested in men's relationships to begin with. So, maybe can you just touch on what those statistics tell us about men's relationship breakups and the risk of suicide?
Totally. So some research that I've done was essentially a review of all of the evidence that's out there looking at connections between relationship breakdown and men's suicidal thoughts, attempt, and death. And what we found is that across the board, when you compare divorced relative to married men, divorced men are at universally higher likelihood of suicide. When you group that by men who are separated relative to men who are married, so men who are kind of navigating that kind of initial period of separation prior to, I guess, the legal resolution of divorce, that kind of proximity to the real emotional upheaval and the kind of tumultuous nature of that separation period is really reflected in much higher suicide rates in that time. So what I found in my study is that particularly younger separated men were at over 8 times the risk of suicide relative to their married counterparts. So it just really highlights that separation is a particular risk factor and a particular period of elevated suicide risk for men. So a really critical time to intervene, and particularly for men's peer support, it's a critical time to kind of delve in and just make sure that you're there and you're doing as much as you can to communicate to that guy that you're available and you are supporting him. Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, it's, looking at those statistics is always quite striking because it's one of the highest risk points potentially in a guy's life is following a breakup, following a divorce, for those broader mental health challenges. So, from a personal perspective and a peer perspective, supporting the guys around us, keeping that in the back of my mind is, I think, really important to know, like, okay, look, no matter what they say about how it's actually going, the stats say that this is a pretty risky time
Yeah.
in guys'
Yeah.
lives.
Yeah. And it can be hard because, if you are supporting a mate who's gone through a breakup, and it can be so hard to know how best to support him. But I think as a sort of baseline, just consistency of checking in, of making yourself available, of saying, hey, I'm here for you. I care about how you're doing. How are you doing? Like actually just consistency of that is most important, because I think particularly if a guy going through a breakup has withdrawn and sort of needs to go internal to sort of process things himself. If no one's sort of reaching out to him, then he can sort of start to think, is there anyone out there? I'm feeling this really profound sense of disconnection because I've lost my partner, and there's no one kind of coming in to, I guess, sort of buffer that or address that gap. So I think consistency of being there and showing your support tangibly is most important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think it's something we're talking about more, as a society. I think for the first time in Australia, anyway, I'm not sure what it looks like in Canada, but relationship issues and or breakdown were the number one risk factor for suicide in men, particularly men aged 25 to 44. And I think for the first time that kind of overtook mood disorders and a history of suicidal ideation and all of these kind of really common known risk factors for suicide. So I think it's becoming more common that we're aware of, the role that these interpersonal kind of life events that you wouldn't typically associate with, mental illness or, the kind of whole mental health realm. They're more just like the stresses of life. But these are fundamentally things that, suicide is an interpersonal phenomenon. And I think it makes sense that interpersonal breakdowns and distresses are such a prominent risk factor here. So something we should all be aware of.
Mm-hmm. And I want to connect, just another aspect of this gendered piece is around self-identity. One of the big factors, one of the big hits that guys can take post breakup is this loss of identity. If you have taken on the role as protector and provider for your family, where you're the primary breadwinner, you've now completely disassociated with that identity. So there's a lot of self-reflection that needs to go on in there, isn't there?
Totally, totally. And I guess from some interviews I've done, a factor that plays a role in terms of like how a relationship benefits men's identity and therefore, once a relationship ends, how that can be impacted is a really common sort of phenomenon where if a man is sort of entering a relationship and is going through, a period of difficult mental health or some challenges, a partner can be someone who sort of helps them hold it together to an extent. I spoke to a guy the other day who said he was going through a really difficult time, but then fortunately met someone who was really invested in helping him get it together and move forward and all of that. And so I think that can really have a positive influence on identity because it helps you sort of go, okay, this is a difficult period I'm dealing with, but I'm still connected to myself and I'm connected to this other person. On the other hand, relying on your partner too much to sort of hold it together for you in a relationship that, as we said before, is something that can stress and strain the health of a relationship. So I think, people going into relationships with kind of pre-existing difficulties, it can be really challenging, particularly from an identity perspective when things break down. So I
Mm-hmm.
think in terms of like how to address that and what to do, if that's something that you're feeling after a breakup, is really just try to reconnect with who you are and who you were outside of the relationship. What do you value? Who do you connect with? Who do you spend time with that sort of brings you joy and like fills your cup to an extent outside of the relationship? Because I think really connecting with that sense of identity outside of a relationship can really help you kind of regain a sense of who you are. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. So yeah, let's talk about this idea of what to do after,
Mm.
or from the perspective of somebody going through it, or I think it's even just good to know if you're looking to support someone else. What are some avenues
Mm.
that can be helpful that guys can go to for support? And both you and I have been kind of in and around some research that's been done
Mm.
around where men look for support following a relationship breakup or, when they're going through some challenges. So,
Mm.
we talked about this idea of self-reflection can be a go-to for some guys, but
Mhm.
lots of guys do look for help externally. What are some
Yeah,
of these avenues that guys might go down?
totally. Yeah. Well, I think what's come up for me most in the guys I've spoken to is a real mix of looking online, seeking help professionally, whether that's from a therapist or a psych or otherwise, or connecting with friends. So they're kind of the main sort of avenues I've seen come up. And there's sort of some complexities there, I think, in terms of particularly online support. We sort of spoke a bit earlier about this whole pop psych relationship advice stuff, and it can be really common for people to go online to help try and understand what's going on for them. But I think what you're seeing online is never going to truly respond to your individual distress. So I think take what you're seeing online with a grain of salt,
Unless you're
and
listening to this
particularly,
podcast.
well, yes, exactly. Take it as gospel. One thing we're interested in at the moment is the whole kind of, I guess, manosphere, manfluencer sort of
Yeah.
movement online, and the role that kind of figures like Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, these sort of influencers can play in, I guess, filling that gap for young guys who are feeling vulnerable and disconnected, particularly after a breakup online, because we know that, social media algorithms and TikTok and all of that, these algorithms know us better than we know ourselves, and they are incredibly sensitive at picking up on, the inner vulnerabilities that we're experiencing. And I think that there's no greater time for that to happen than after a breakup. And so what we've seen from some research is that, it can be really common for young guys who are feeling particularly vulnerable and disenfranchised after a breakup, particularly if they've experienced rejection or they've sort of repeatedly been kind of left from partners, to start to get advice online that creates this sort of adversarial narrative around men versus women, and feminism is kind of a bad thing for society and for men. And, it just creates this sort of anger and this vindictiveness. And, the research in this area is really, really novel, and it's, a really unexplored area. But I think what is coming through is that breakups can be a really common trigger for men to sort of descend into those echo chambers and start to hear these narratives over and over and over that, aren't necessarily adaptive or helpful for their mental health in the long term. So I think it's just really important for people to be aware of the kinds of content that they're consistently being presented with online, and just actually think for yourself, like, do you personally agree with what sort of narratives you're getting, or are you sort of just taking on board the advice because it's just being fed to you and it's sort of just being absorbed, subconsciously? So really try and reflect on personally, what do you individually feel about what you're seeing, and does it resonate with you? Yeah. So.
Yeah. And, it's often easier said than done too, right? It's similar to, politics. Social media is great at building that divide, and
Mm,
making people more polarized of, one side versus the other. We've seen it in the political system in the United States. We're seeing it similarly with, relationships and men versus
mm,
women as well online.
mm.
But I think it's important to note how difficult it is not to get sucked into that.
Oh, totally, totally.
We're all on social media. I'm sure your feed is similar to mine because we're in this space that I see these things popping up. And it's often, people say, oh, well, how could anybody fall for that? But there's kind of a cascade that occurs where these young guys are going online. They're saying, oh man, like, look at this. He's well dressed, smoking a cigar, standing in front of a car, like, this fancy car. That's cool. And then, in the guy's next video, he's talking about how women are the devil and promoting abuse. Like, these guys that are, especially young guys that are going online finding this information, it's an indoctrination process essentially
Mm,
that
mm.
kind of takes them down this path. It doesn't all just happen all at once.
Totally. And I think, from what I've understood, again, it's a very kind of new phenomenon, but I think it's the guys that don't have as many in-person connections or sources of, I guess, what we call like corrective evidence. It's those sort of guys that might be more isolated, that might not have as many friends in person. They seem to be more likely to get sort of sucked down these rabbit holes. And I think it's not all bad. I think there can be this really sort of alarmist narrative that all of this content should just be banned and we should
Mm,
just get rid of all these influences and that would solve the problem. But I don't think it would. I think we need to understand what these young guys are getting from these sort of influences and this kind of content. Because if we just remove it, for some of these guys, that might be the only thing keeping them going, stopping them from suicide, for example.
mm.
So I think it's important to understand the ways in which interpersonal rejection and disconnection can really drive people further away from any source of connection. And I think it's particularly guys that are isolated to begin with that are most at risk here. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk more about those kind of peer connections, how we can support a buddy going through a breakup or
Mm.
lean on a buddy if we're going through a breakup. In the study that we did recently, it was one of the main challenges in guys' lives that
Yeah.
they would look to a close friend to troubleshoot, to debrief about what's going on. So, what are some of the unique benefits to kind of having guys connect over those
Mm.
challenges?
I think the benefits are really in validation of what you're experiencing. And I think it's important to sort of delineate whether people are looking for like emotional support and just a space to vent and be heard, or whether they're looking for advice and they're looking for, here's what you should do. It's important for men's supports to try and be aware of what your buddy is most looking for in the moment. If he comes to you and asks for some support, it can be as simple as sort of saying, are you wanting a space to vent right now? Do you just want to be listened to and validated? Or do you want me to tell you what I think you should do in this situation? And not sort of jumping into one or the other too quickly, I think is really important for men's peer supports, because it can be uncomfortable sometimes if someone comes to you and it's like, oh, I'm really needing help with this situation. But jumping too quickly into something, I think, is less beneficial than sort of taking a bit more time and going, okay, how can we understand this issue and how can we work out how I can best support you together? Similar to what I was saying before around, working with your partner to solve the problem together and sort of externalizing the problem and working on it together. It's a similar thing here with, with peer supports. It's okay, here's the issue. How can we understand it more together? And what do you most need from me right now?
hmm And I don't think that necessarily happens enough. Oftentimes, the default might be, hey, you broke up. Let's get you back on the horse. Let's get you out to the bar. We'll have some beers. We'll forget about it. And then you can go and talk to some girls, talk to some people. And it's kind of just this avoidance, or trying to, accelerate that process of moving on
Yes.
that can be the default, especially for guys, I think.
That is sort of the main thing that's come up in my interviews in terms of,
Okay.
because I'm asking people, who've been through a recent breakup, what are people saying to you? What advice are you getting? What's resonating and what's not? And I think the main thing that is not resonating is these sort of ideas around, let's just get you back out there, let's get you on Tinder, let's get you with someone else as quickly as possible. And it's complex because I think to an extent, at some point, that is probably going to be useful, for someone who's gone through a breakup and the relationship is beyond repair and there's, it's not healthy for them to stay together. That person should move on and should move through it and should find a way to move forward. And to some extent, seeing new people, getting back out there again is healthy and is part of that. But I think the problem comes when we jump too quickly into doing that and we don't give men enough space to really process the loss and the grief of their relationship breakdown before delving into, jumping back out there and getting back in the saddle. So I think it's really, really important for men's peer supports not to kind of default to doing that. Like it's a bit of a low-hanging fruit. Like it kind of makes sense, I'll just get him back out there, make him feel better with some new connections. And I think, it's admirable that we want to do the easiest, the quickest thing to solve the problem. It's, it makes sense. But I think sitting with the discomfort more and particularly asking men, what's going to be most useful for you right now, and not just assuming and just jumping into the default option, I think is key. Because
Mm-hmm.
everyone I've spoken to has just said, I was getting this advice, but I was like, I can't think of anything worse right now than going out and trying to meet new people. I'm still so hung up on this ex. I feel like I need to just process that more. And so I think coming in and sitting with that processing and that distress and that discomfort is what, particularly in the more acute stages of relationship breakdown, that can be what guys are sort of needing most. Yeah.
From an age perspective, I think it's often assumed that maybe it's easier for younger guys than older guys. And,
Mhm.
in a more established relationship, sure, there's maybe more to navigate in terms of, if you're sharing finances, if you are living under the same roof, you've obviously built stronger connections and ties over time. But it's not to say that these things don't really impact young men as well. And
Mhm.
maybe the assumption, kind of around that promiscuity piece that we talked about earlier, that men should just, you're young, get out there again, you should be meeting lots of women, this kind of thing.
Mhm.
And I know you're doing some work currently around the social support that young men look for during a breakup. Is there anything in particular that stands out to you that impacts young guys in particular?
I suppose I think in terms of the emotional reactions we were sort of talking about earlier, I think, young adulthood, particularly if it's someone's first serious relationship that ends, I think that can be, even if it's not a kind of long-term relationship, not, 5 to 10 years or whatever, we tend to sort of feel things a bit more when we're younger, I think. And so that's something that's come up, I think, for the younger guys is just this idea that, and maybe it's because of the sort of romanticized idea that once you've found the one, you're sorted forever. But I think when we're younger, there's this, sense that things really come crashing down a lot more if our relationship ends. And it's not to say that doesn't happen for older guys, but I think, if it's a divorce, for example, and it's, maybe a 20-year relationship that comes to an end, it's more likely for people to spend longer trying to work on the relationship and fix the issues prior to getting to the point of divorce. So I think, it's potentially, it doesn't always happen, but it can be more common in circumstance of divorce for people to spend a longer period maybe processing the end of the relationship before it actually ends.
Mm.
Whereas I think for younger guys, it can be more common for it to be quite a sudden end and for them to be quite blindsided, just because it's more normal to go through breakups in younger adulthood. It's just a normal part of life as a young person. But that doesn't mean it's any easier. And I think emotional reactivity is quite high in this age in general. Impulsivity is higher in youth as
Mm.
well. So yeah, I think it's complex and there's a lot of kind of different factors at play. But I think, it can be a time, as I said, where you just feel it a bit more for whatever reason.
Yeah. And I suppose from the perspective of somebody supporting a buddy going through a breakup, one of the other things that came up in some of the interviews we did is around this kind of expectation of the rate at which things get better. It
Yeah.
was, guys felt this pressure that if they had a conversation with their buddy did the right thing and said, hey, do you want some, I can see you're going through a tough time. Let's go grab a beer. Let's go talk about this. Tell me what's
Mm,
going on.
mm,
And then the expectation is that a week later, well, didn't we talk about this? We've already solved this
mm,
issue, right? We're
mm,
moving on. Why haven't you moved on? Tell me a bit about kind of the role of ongoing support
mm.
and kind of checking in periodically with that person.
I think that can be really common and it can be a sign, that maybe someone is struggling after a relationship breakdown. If they're bringing up the same things over and over and they feel sort of stuck in the same conversations, the same patterns, they're quote unquote hung up on their ex. I think that can be a sign, particularly if you notice that it starts to affect someone's day-to-day functioning. If they're not socializing at much, it's affecting their work, things like that. That can be a sign that someone really is struggling. So I think that's where, there's a really important role of ongoing peer support and recognizing that things are unlikely to get better overnight or after one or two, conversations and check-ins at the pub. So it's really important, just as I said before, for consistency to really communicate how much you are there and how often you are there, but also within reason, recognizing that there's only so much you can do as a supporter for one of your friends going through a breakup. And, knowing your limits and your kind of boundaries as well, I think is really important and kind of recognizing when you might be reaching your limit in terms of the support you can provide. Because, it's something I've experienced supporting friends through breakups. Like it's so hard to know like what's going to be most useful in terms of, helping them to move forward independently, but also communicating to them that I'm here and I'm supporting you. So helping them to sort of to find that balance is really challenging, but is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
And, I think that's pretty powerful because, you're somebody that works in this space. You've got experience, how tips and tricks for kind of dealing with this. So I think it just
Mm.
goes to show kind of the challenge of supporting someone through anything really.
Mm.
And, I think it's important that, it's not necessarily about what you do or don't do or what you say or don't say. It's
Mm.
more about the kind of overall approach of, being there for someone.
Yep.
Maybe you didn't deliver the message perfectly, but the idea behind the message is still there that,
Mm.
I'm here for you. I'm doing my best. You're doing your best.
Mhm.
Let's support each other.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's a really good kind of take home message, I suppose, is it doesn't necessarily matter what you do or what you say, but I think if you're leading with connection and empathy and care for that person and showing that you're there and you want to help them through it, that's, you're already starting from a good place if that's where you're coming from. So again, I think it's about not delving too quickly into what feels like the best solution, but really starting with, okay, I'm here, let's work together. How can we, solve this? How can I be most useful for you? Yeah, leading with connection and empathy, I think is the best way to go always.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we've gotten through a lot of topics today. I think, we've touched on internet, we've touched on,
Yeah. In a
good
whirlwind.
relationships, bad relationships, and how to deal with them.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your time, Michael. There's some brilliant suggestions in there, and we'll have to connect another time to dive more deep into some of these other topics.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you for having me. And I hope for all listeners out there, it's been useful. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Be sure to check out the In Good Company website to learn more about men's social connection and peer support. Have a burning question or an idea for a future episode? We'd love to hear from you. Drop us a line at mens.health@ubc.ca. Thanks for listening.